Hello, I'm Martin Sixsmith. I'm here to speak to Dr. Andrew McDonald about his book, Changing States, Changing Nations, which is published by Heart in January 2021. The book raises key questions about how we think of ourselves and how we determine where we feel we belong, and how those very complex self-perceptions can then be meshed with the rather blunt matrix of constitutional definitions, and how do lawmakers reflect personal identity in the way that they define national identities. So I suppose we should begin by asking, what is national identity? And most of us have a nationality recorded in our passports, but it's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's becoming yet more complicated. I think over time we are beginning to move from a concept of the nation which is based on a common culture, a common history, a common language, to one that is based on a common set of beliefs and values which people buy into and make a conscious decision to buy into. And the book argues that liberal democracies are increasingly choosing that new model of the nation, which is in many ways the model that the Americans introduced us to. America is often called the first modern nation because it is built on those values which are embedded in the Constitution.
So we can feel ourselves belonging to a nation, but that's the product really of many things, isn't it? It's products of language, belief, history, geographical location, common cultural references. If we look at the United Kingdom, for instance, the UK has a particularly complicated dynamic in terms of identity, with a pretty wide range of choices available to us. I could be English, or I could be British. My wife could be Scottish, or she could be British. And my friends in Ulster could be British, but most of them regard themselves as Irish.
Indeed, I think this first struck me when I went to watch England play Scotland in the 1996 Euro Championships. I was supporting England, and at the English end of the ground, people were waving Union Jacks. It captured the rather complicated nature of perceptions of Britishness. I think that complication has only grown with devolution. One sees amongst the Welsh and the Scots a diminishing attachment to Britishness, a greater attachment to Welshness or Scottishness. That's going to be something that will be worked out over time, which I think is going to have profound implications for the future of the Union.
And there's resentment involved as well, isn't there? Certainly among the Scots. And my Scottish in-laws always tell me that when somebody heroic is described, like Andy Murray, he's described as British, but when somebody villainous like gangsters and crooks, they're always described as Scottish.
Yes, I don't know about the truth in that, but there's unquestionably, there is that resentment. And I think there is increasing tension, which we've seen just recently through the COVID pandemic, as to whether or not one part of the union or the other is handling the pandemic better, whether or not there's a fair share of the vaccine, for example, across the border. There's a story that was running in the last week. So there is that tension within the union, and I think that will need to be resolved if devolution is to become something that bolsters the union rather than causes it to weaken.
Well, you chart the years of constitutional debate in the UK and the reforms that eventually led to devolution. And I think it's probably fair to say that devolution has sharpened people's sense of being Scottish, the sense of Scottishness, or probably the same with Welshness. Has it done the same for people's sense of Englishness?
I'm not sure there's any evidence that it has done that directly, but there is interesting evidence from opinion polls about the way in which, since devolution, but whether or not it's linked to devolution or not is a matter of debate, but since devolution, the ethnic minorities' perception of Englishness has changed. There is an increasing attachment to Britishness, an increasing suspicion of Englishness. Again, I think that's one of the tensions that will need to be worked out over the coming years.
And Englishness has this rather sort of unpleasant, or has gained a rather unpleasant overtone of right-wing xenophobia. We see the St. George's Cross waved by right-wing groups marching through the streets. Has that been exacerbated by devolution, or was that always there?
I think it's been there for a long time. It certainly predates devolution, but I think you're right to point out the potential perils of it. It also relates to a nervousness on the part of the left to engage with the whole concept of the nation. In some ways, it's ironic that the left, which is after all about collective entities, should be so nervous about embracing the nation. The nation is potentially a means of social solidarity, binding people together, not dividing them apart. But certainly in respect of England, the left in this country has been very slow to take that view.
What about the role of religion? And if we look first just at the branches of Christianity, that's a very divisive factor, certainly in Northern Ireland, clearly, but also in parts of the west of Scotland.
I think it's both been divisive. It's also one of the features that's defined nationhood for many people. If, for example, you look at the history of the Irish who came to England during or after the war, one of the things that continued to define them as Irish was their attachment to Catholicism. So it cuts both ways.
And what about the non-white communities? If we look at the communities from the Asian subcontinent, are we seeing changes there? We all remember Norman Tebbett's cricket test about whether people supported England in the cricket or whether they supported Pakistan. Is that still relevant, if indeed it ever was relevant?
Well, I'm not sure, as you hint, it ever was a terribly good guide. And indeed, specifically in terms of cricket, what we're now seeing is, I think it's a terribly good thing, but one seeing British Asians far more prominent within the team and within the cricket community as a whole. But I think, again, I'd refer you back to the polling evidence, which suggests that ethnic minorities are far more comfortable with the British label than they are with Englishness, because Englishness is mired with that association with the far right, to which you referred a few minutes ago.
If we look further afield, your analysis of constitutional reform in Canada inevitably highlights the linguistic split. Can we hazard a guess at who in Canada feels to be truly Canadian? So, for instance, is a French speaker from Quebec ever going to feel fully identified with an English speaker, say, from Vancouver?
Well, I think the Canadian case is a very interesting one, because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was pioneered by and eventually taken into legislation by Pierre Trudeau, has become a symbol for right across the Canadian nation, whether the Anglo or Franco part of it, has become a unifying symbol of what it is to be Canadian. And so a Quebecer may have a different notion in some ways of what it is to be Canadian, but he or she would share common values with an Anglo-Canadian from, say, Ontario. So I think constitutions can be unifying forces. To look, for example, at the Grundgesetz in Germany, the fundamental law, where out of the ruins of the Second World War emerged a constitution which bound initially everybody in West Germany together. So I think it's important to see constitutions as potential levers that can be used to unify nations, as well as mere decorations on the sort of constitutional artifact face.
The other example you look at is Australia, and here we might argue that a constitutional arrangement has become quite a divisive element in the sense of Australian national identity, and I mean the affiliation to the Commonwealth and to the UK. Is it as simple as saying that the split is between the older generation who still feel that loyalty to Britain and the coming new generation who are very much in favour of Australia going it alone as an independent republic?
I think there's something in that, unquestionably, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens after the present reign as to whether or not Australian allegiance to the Crown remains. But it's also more complicated than that, because one of the reasons that the Republic referendum was lost in Australia was a debate about, a disagreement about what sort of republic also the Australians should have. And I think there's a lesson for those who are of a unionist persuasion, wherever they happen to be in the world, that they need to articulate their case fully if they want unions to survive. It applies very much in the United Kingdom. I don't think it's sufficient for those who want the union to survive simply to say no to independence, to put forward negative arguments. I think it's terribly important that they articulate reasons why the union should survive, and that they articulate what sort of constitutional arrangements would best support the union. I think that's going to be an important issue over the coming years, when we're undoubtedly going to see increased pressure for a second independence referendum.
Do you feel perhaps that the proponents of union the world over are fighting a bit of a losing battle? Because we've seen it certainly in the UK with the splintering of the nations. We've seen it in Europe with the European ideal coming under strain. You've mentioned Australia. Is it a global phenomenon, or is this just a coincidence that it's all happening at the same time?
I'm not sure it's necessarily a splintering across the world. I think I would see it more as a warning to those who want nations to cohere, that they need to put their work in. If, for example, we look at the question of the continued union of Britain, it's no good for those who favour the union to begin work as and when a referendum campaign begins. They need to be thinking now about what sort of future constitutional arrangements would best support the union. They need to be thinking now about what sort of questions should be put to the people. After all, we in Britain have seen what happens with a referendum over Brexit, where the choice put to the people was not clearly defined. I think it's critical that any future independence referendum does define clearly the choice put to the people.
Let's look at the United States. I remember 30 years ago talking to Arthur Schlesinger, and even then he said that America was at a turning point, that the old traditional melting pot ethos, where incomers were very eager to blend into established American society, defined through, I suppose, the English language and loyalty to the flag, was on the wane. And this is 30 years ago. And he said that there was a rise of a new generation of ethnic and linguistic and religious minorities, much more willing, much keener to identify themselves as separate from this sort of overall Americanness. So he felt then it was a blow to the sort of social conformity of the melting pot ethos, and that things were going to get worse. Do you think they have got worse over the last 30 years?
I think it would be hard to look back across the Trump years and reach any other conclusion. On both sides, one sees both naked white supremacism, which has been particularly ugly and obvious in recent months, but also one has seen over the last 20 years or so an increasing, rather as Schlesinger hinted to you, an increasing desire of immigrant communities to retain their individual identity, whether it's through language or culture. And it's a warning to those who, like me, believe that the future for the nation is based on common values and common beliefs. That has to be a genuine commitment to those common values and beliefs, because what we've seen during the Trump era is an ostensible commitment to those same values and beliefs by both sides in the argument. And yet one still sees played out, as in Washington in recent weeks, the ugliest of disagreements between the two sides. So it has to be a genuine commitment to those beliefs. Playing lip service to them doesn't work.
No, and perhaps would we think that might be a warning to other nations who are losing that sort of social glue? I'm thinking, of Spain, for instance, with the minorities there, or even the United Kingdom. Is the melting pot really a thing of yesterday? And are we in a new era where it's going to be much harder to hold nations together?
I think it's a warning that it requires conscious effort, and the melting pot may not be the right model. It may be that a version of multiculturalism is what's needed. Spain is an interesting example that you cite, because one has the continuing torment of Catalonia, which serves as a warning, but one also, if one looks across at the Basque country, one sees a much more settled picture than one saw 10, 20 years ago. So constitutional settlements can be reached. It is possible to bind the nation together, but it requires effort by those who believe in constitutional democracy to come up with solutions which are attractive to the people.
Well, on that note, I'll say that rather positive, optimistic note, I'll say thank you very much, Andrew. The book is fascinating and thought-provoking. It's very closely argued throughout, and it's packed with original research and interviews, which will stand future researchers and historians in very good stead. The book's called Changing States, Changing Nations by Dr. Andrew McDonald, and it's published in January 2021 by Hart.
Thank you, Martin.